Hi there, and welcome to my small YouTube channel. Today I'll be talking about drawing and painting portraits. Over the past 60 years, I don't know how many portraits I've drawn or painted for friends, family, and other people. I've used pencils, pens, chalk and oil pastels, and a variety of paints. I didn't really start creating portraits professionally and getting paid for them until I enrolled at art school. I was never a starving artist, but I did have bills to pay, and they helped. I can bang out a pencil or pen and ink sketch quite quickly, of which I drew many because most people can afford them. While living on a sailboat, I even did quick sketches of people down at the ferry terminal while they waited for a ferry. They were $15 a pop. That was a lot of fun, and I met a lot of people from all over the world. I also donated my time sketching students at a dry grad, where the kids spent all night at the local high school. That was a lot of fun too, and I have no idea how many kids I drew because there were well over 100 teenagers. Many of the portraits I was hired to sketch or paint were highly valued and very sentimental to some of my customers. One such person, an aging Jewish man, walked into my studio with a painting of his father, who was a rabbi. He had 2 sons, and they both wanted the painting. Since he didn't want to choose which son would receive the painting when he died, he asked if I could paint a copy of it. I told him I'd give it a try, and if it didn't work out, he wouldn't have to pay for it. I set the paintings side by side on a shelf, and you should have seen his eyes light up when he saw them. He asked, "Which one is the original?" Perhaps I should have become an art forger. The only other painting I ever copied was a portrait of Van Gogh. Since he still had his ear at this point, I made it look as if he had cut a hole in the canvas where his ear was. When I had a studio in downtown Nanaimo, I used to frequent a cafe just down the street. Funny, I can still see the pretty waitress's face, but I can't remember her name, even though we became friends. One day, after serving me, she sat down at the table across from me and asked how much I would charge for a portrait. I still remember her sad, sad words when she told me she had cancer and didn't have long to live, and she wanted to have a portrait painted of her to give to her mother. I used Prismacolor pencil crayons to draw a portrait of a baby girl for a good friend of mine and his wife. Her name was Amber, and I don't remember the disease she had, but she wasn't expected to live very long. Even though her mouth was quite deformed, she had a wonderful smile, and that's one of the reasons I put a butterfly on her little hand. Needless to say, I gave them the portrait shortly after she died, and when their house burnt down, because I had taken a photo of it, I drew it again. Man, just thinking about the waitress and Amber almost brings tears to my eyes. Of course, all the portraits weren't sad. I remember a doctor asking for a portrait while he waited for a ferry to Vancouver. Most of his patients were kids, and they called him Dr. Bill. Even though he was a good-looking man, he had a huge nose. I mean, a real honker. I remember him saying to me, "Make it a profile. I want this nose to really stand out." I couldn't miss out on that caricature. It was the easiest one I had ever done. The smallest portrait, well, actually a double portrait, I painted was of a man and wife. He had built a small rendition of his home to scale, and the picture had to hang on the small living room wall. The painting was about the size of a small postage stamp, and I think I used a brush with about 2 or 3 hairs. It was quite a chore. While living on my sailboat, I wish I could remember his name, but I met a man who had read and seen all the illustrations of Arctic Odyssey, a book which I had written about sailing the Northwest Passage with a couple of friends of mine. I was a young man then, only 50. He and his wife had just finished traversing the Northwest Passage, and he too had written a book and wanted me to draw a pen and ink sketch, a portrait of him and his wife. I've drawn celebrities too, but just for myself, although I did meet and shake Roy Orbison's hand backstage while masquerading as a photographer. I actually drew Orbison using Procreate on my iPad, and to me, the computer is often just like another tool. It didn't really save me any time than drawing him on a piece of paper, but it was still fun to do. I've also painted and drew my 6 kids, plus some of the grandkids as well. My niece commissioned me to paint her daughter riding a dragon of sorts, because she was into the dragon thing at that early stage in her life. I've also produced a few self-portraits at different ages in my life. The latest one was just a few years ago. I think I was 80 then. Boy, does time fly. I've also drawn and painted my girlfriends over the years, even in the nude. I didn't marry at an early age. What a disaster that would have been. I was very immature for my years, and being somewhat of a flaky artist and poet may have had something to do with it as well. However, I have drawn and painted my wife Sarah quite a few times, and not just as gifts, but because, for a simple explanation, I really love her, and in my eyes, she's absolutely gorgeous in every way. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I'll portrait of us together, a caricature similar to the mermaid, and title it The Young Chick and the Old Fart. After all, there's a 25-year gap between our ages, and I am rather flatulent at times. Painted portraits are more apt to hang on a wall rather than photographs. Not because they are more important, but because, since we age so quickly, we keep replacing them with more recent photographs. I haven't been commissioned to paint a portrait for some time now, and I think the last painting I did for someone was of their cottage. However, if I'm honest, I don't get off on those sort of paintings. Rigid buildings, no matter how quaint and filled with character they are, just doesn't do it for me. No, I'd rather paint people, pets, animals, trees, and even fish. Since I was a stable boy at a racetrack for many years, I have an affinity for horses, and perhaps that's why I like painting them so much. The painting of Yippee-Ki-Yay was painted while undergoing radiation treatments for cancer. And to be honest, if this was to be my last painting, I wanted to capture the spirit of a wild stallion, and not that of a fading old man, even if my spirit was still similar. I don't know if I'm itching to paint another portrait again, or if it's just an old man itch, but on that note, it needs immediate attention. However, before I go, I hope you enjoyed this small YouTube channel post, and if you did, be sure to give it a like and subscribe.